Association of Power Systems. And is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And Carter is an community relations, in charge of community relations
Stakeholder relations specialist.
with AES, which is a solar or an energy power company, a national, international,
Global.
global
Yep.
power company. So maybe let me start with asking both of you, whoever wants to go first, just to tell the folks a little bit about your job and what you do.
Okay, I'll start. Thanks again, Lauren, and thanks to CCL. I remember when I met Lauren and Tom and the whole crew from CCL and Bill, and you guys are doing God's work, really. Bringing people together around climate is not easy, but you're doing it. And it's a Saturday afternoon. Look at how many people are here. So thanks for the invitation. I manage the state and federal government affairs for an energy association. Think of it as a consortium of municipally owned electric utilities. So just to level set for everyone, you have in the world of electric providers, the electric co-ops. Think a lot of rural service territory, rural parts of the state. And then you have the 800-pound gorilla, the investor-owned utility, Pacific Corp or Rocky Mountain Power. And then you have the third group, my people, the munis or the government-owned power. Essentially, I represent 50 municipally owned electric utilities. Actually, the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority is also one of our members. So Native American tribe is represented in our group as well. And the same objective is there for us as these other electric providers, right? We're seeking to develop generation resources, provide projects that our members can participate in. So these cities would otherwise be precluded in many ways from participating in generation projects. By generation, I mean just a solar farm or a wind farm or a natural gas plant, because of how capital intense they are. But by aggregating their need and their interests and their collective strength on the financing side, their collective bonding authority, they can really do some meaningful stuff. And so I work with state and local elected officials because most of my members are municipalities. So I'm working with mayors and city councils, and then of course legislators and federal delegation staff and the members themselves. And just want to say, when I was at BYU, it was a pleasure to help run and work on Mayor. And I didn't run, sorry, help Mayor Curtis run. And it's just so pleased. I'm just so pleased to see where he's at. And I was sad that I missed him. So.
And I'm just going to interrupt to say that when I met Mike, he was the staff person that we met with in the Washington, D.C. office of former Representative Mia Love. And this was our first lobbying experience and our first lobby meeting. And I thought, oh, what a waste of time this is going to be, but we'll just give it a go. We'll try it out. And it was so great. And I'm so excited that Mike now has like a lifelong career in helping to make the environment better. And it's really, really been great. And if you have any questions about how to lobby more effectively, Mike is your guy.
Well, thanks. Well, Mike's reputation, I had not met Mike before, but a number of my colleagues had. They're like, oh, you will learn a lot from him. He's one of the best here. And so we're lucky, quite honestly, to have him here today. Yeah, it's true. It's true. I'm really, really excited to be here. I got this message from as I call her, my big boss, Amanda Smith, who's a senior vice president for AES, which is a global energy company with our clean energy headquarters here in Salt Lake City, right there in Sugar House. Amanda is a mutual friend of all three of ours and a leader in the state. She was she's kind of led all in all different departments, but she ran the DEQ for quite a while, and then she started with a company called S-Power that was a subsidiary of AES. And so way back in March of 2020, moments before the pandemic, or maybe just after it had started, I got a call from Amanda, and she's like, hey, have you ever been to Nephi? And I'm like, sure, on my way to St. George. She's like, we've got a big project there that we're working on, a big utility scale solar project that was going to be sold to a counterpart of Mike's a group called UMPA, Utah Municipal Power Association, which represents 6 central Utah cities. The pandemic started. She said, we still need the help. We were going to work to get a tax increment from the school district that was going to be critical to this project happening or not happening. So therein lied my challenge, get people in central Utah to say yes to a tax increment for a solar project. It was like much of what Congressman Curtis said. Actually, take a step back. He was the chair of UMPA, when they decided to buy the power from S-Power for the project in Clover. The project's actually in Mona. How many of y'all seen the solar farm? All right. We do have tours every now and then, so we'd love to schedule one with the group here. It's always fascinating. We've got sheep out there doing dual grazing. It's really a great story about how clean energy can work in communities when you work with the community. And we continue to do that to this day. We worked with the school district on the CRA. We work with.
And what is the CRA?
Sorry, I'm glad. Sorry you said that. That's the term, another acronym for the tax increment. So
And the tax, you said tax
increment.
increment.
Yeah.
Maybe explain to folks what,
This is going to be tricky. It's an exchange or increment in exchange of paying now, you pay over the course of time. Essentially, it's you pay the school district in lieu of taxes over the course of 20 years, 30 years, depending on how long the project
you're
is.
asking the community to pay a little more in tax.
No, it
No?
is straight up exchanges. There's no increase. It's just this is why it's a tricky thing. You need a tax lawyer to help because how they treat property taxes versus real property versus property tax, it's all very different. And solar's even treated more differently. But bottom line, you had to get buy-in from the community. And
that's your job.
and that was our job. And work with the school district, see where the value was for them to say yes to joining this essentially zoning district to reap the benefits from this big project that was coming into their community. We work closely with the Juab School District with their STEM education. We gave money to their Hive, which is a joint use facility that both the city and the school district use and has classrooms. And we're working kind of more forward thinking with them if we do in fact work to get a battery storage system to add value to the already in place solar farm.
So let me ask you guys, how do you, can you give some examples of where you deal with permitting for new energy projects, whether it be federal permitting, state or local?
Yeah, certainly. So like I mentioned, one of the reasons for which UAMPS exists is to facilitate the development of energy projects called generation resources.
An example of an energy project would be
we own and operate the Horse Butte Wind Farm in Idaho, or we own a natural gas plant in Payson. So project development is at the heart of what we're seeking to do and we're doing regularly on behalf of our members. And that could mean also working with not us solely developing the project, but of course working with an entity like AES or S-Power or whomever to develop these projects to a certain level of maturity, at which point we will either, of course, there's a number of different ways you could approach this, but essentially a lot of times too, it could be that we're owning the asset. So in the case of the Horse Butte Wind project, we're owning that asset versus us entering into a contractual arrangement with a developer for the purchase of that power. So there's two different sort of ownership or models and ways in which utilities can procure that power. They can own it or they're contractually purchasing that power. Either way, we develop is in the course of developing projects. If we're running up against one in particular, as we talk about renewables in the West, the grid, right? And the need for, we hear a lot in Washington about the need for permitting reform, and that's largely in many ways looking at how are we what's holding up transmission, right? If the idea.
And when you say the grid and transmission, you're saying electricity.
Correct.
And you're saying, how can we get the clean energy onto the grid? Is that right?
Correct. So let's like, we all, understand and recognize that climate change is the crisis that it is. We're wanting to, and I think you see this trend across a lot of utilities. I know I'll speak on behalf of UAMPS. We recently, as many have maybe heard in the news, we're developing a small modular nuclear reactor. That was at the heart of our carbon-free strategy, whereby we would, of course, in the future, have this carbon-free generation that was, providing that 24/7 capacity generation that would allow us to also more easily integrate the growing renewable energy footprint, not only of our own members, but in the West. The point of all that was to, of course, get to, addressing this climate crisis, right? So as utilities, and we see this trend, and AES can speak more intelligently to the trends, but for us, at the heart of getting more renewable energy projects online, one of the constraints we're dealing with is transmission, right? Because where solar resources is most ideal is not always where people live. And same with wind resource, right? In Wyoming, right, where we have an abundance of wind, there are very few people, relatively speaking. So we're going to need to transmit all of that power from one locale to the other. And that requires us to have this conversation, this very uncomfortable conversation around transmission. So one of the things we've looked at, and one of the things, or I guess the challenge we're presented is, how do we expand transmission further in a state that's largely federally owned, like the state of Utah? One of the things we ran into recently was looking at, for some of our members in the southeast part of the state, who one of them is still burning diesel generators, right? To really avail them.
Partner.
Yeah, the Chickasaw Special Utility District. They are almost
provide power to some of your customers.
They are their own special utility district, and so they are, but they're also functioning largely in a bit of an island, an energy island of sorts. And we looked at, and I know Garcane had looked at, the co-op that serves largely that part of the state, had looked at, okay, how do we get, there's obviously great solar resource down there. How do we avail ourselves of that solar resource? Well, it's going to be transmission. Okay, well, next step would be, well, how do we site this transmission? And on what land are we siting
And
this
when you say
transmission?
site this transmission, can you help explain to folks what that means?
Well, where are we going to place the towers and the actual infrastructure to run wires, essentially, to connect where the load is needed, or where the load is, or where the energy is needed, to where the generation is actually occurring. So transmission is a huge component. Putting that infrastructure in the ground obviously would trigger NEPA. Furthermore, we're trying to site this transmission over areas of sensitive animal habitat, BLM land, Park Service land.
SITLA.
SITLA. I mean, the stakeholder engagement, and I think this is where AES has, tremendous value add here to this conversation, is, the stakeholder engagement is really intense. So to answer your question, and I'll say this and then I'll pivot over to you, is that we're dealing with this idea that we can't site transmission, and in order to actually avail ourselves of more renewable energy on the system, when I say the system, the whole network of wires throughout the West, the Western Interconnect, we will need more transmission. We are growing our need for energy in the West, and our membership is like this, and that's not factoring in EV penetration, which continues to rise.
And you mean the fact that we're having more electric vehicles that are going to be
Correct.
taking exponentially greater proportion of our transmission needs?
Yeah. So again, it's we can't go to Congress, and if you've noticed anywhere in this room, Congress is very, very functioning, right? They get everything done. You need something that's going to be a quick turnaround. Well, that's problematic, right? Because if we're wanting to get a right of way or utility corridors over a right of way over federal land that has not only several stakeholders, but several federal stakeholders and Congress, you can see where some of the bottleneck occurs. So with regard to permitting reform, that's probably the bigger area that we run into. And it's all really come down to NEPA, but I'll pivot to AES and let Carter.
Well, actually, I had a really great opportunity about 2 or 3 weeks ago to hear Congressman Curtis speak to the Colorado Storage and Solar Association. It was a big group of about 1,000 people, and he gave a good talk, and he talked a good bit about this issue, transmission and permitting an issue. How do we get here? And he put them kind of together as we work towards solving all these problems, because they're kind of in a similar bucket if you look at them. Where can you do things? And we need to do things faster, be able to get power faster to more people or to buildings because they need to store a lot of information. There are all sorts of different reasons why. Like Mike was saying, it's interesting. We'll work with multiple layers, and it depends on where the project is, who is the ultimate decision-making authority. And that could end up being multiple people. It could be 15 different authorities, depending on where the project is. We like to partner with folks that are local. Sometimes we will partner. We have a great partnership with the Aspen Valley Land Trust in Colorado to work with them on easements near projects, so we can kind of help work together to figure out transmission issues. Because it's going to take a lot of working together, both locally, federally, and having people like Congressman Curtis help guide through both.
So let me ask you, are there areas where you find the permitting process to be helpful? Let's start with that.
It's
Or useful or good?
Well,
Is there a value to it that
Well,
you think?
I think that I always, it's a stakeholder opportunity. I think it's an opportunity to both work with the local internal government that helps manage the planning of a community and get to know them. Where are they trying to go to? And certainly regionally and, local, county and, broader. I think that, and earlier is better. What I think is that it kind of depends on different counties have different levels of sophistication on how they handle permitting processes. They're starting to learn more and more because there are more of us going out trying to get projects permitted. So it often depends on what.
Do you need, people might be wondering, do you need locals to support your project in order to get, say, a federal permit? What role do local communities play in getting that federal permit?
I think they're the single most important stakeholder always, is you've got to work with they may not be the ones making the ultimate decisions, but they can be the ones that stop the decisions being made.
And how would they do that?
Y'all are here today. Y'all probably stopped stuff, started stuff, well, one of the things
Well,
that's
not us. We
No,
don't,
no.
we wouldn't.
What's never lost on me is I get the opportunity to travel around mostly the West, and I live here in Utah. When you go to these rural communities, every time you go, you learn something more. But when you leave, they're still there, and they are talking to themselves about whatever you're talking about. It's important to keep that conversation going because there's a lot of trust that's built. That's a lot of the work is with the locals is working with them and doing what you say you're going to do and being consistent, because they've seen too many companies come in and out that they don't trust. And so that's an industry thing. It's important for all of us to do what we say, and because the guys that are his mayors can make a big difference on whether these projects happen, even if they're not the ones making the ultimate decision.
I was just going to say, going back to and I love that you, Carter, brought up trust, because I feel like before I move on to answering your question real fast, I think that frankly, what you all are doing, CCL, is incredibly important. And I think it's because it's building trust. When you think about the entire, and I'm an attorney, and so to answer your question, like NEPA, I'm a huge fan of process. Process is incredibly important. And process exists for a reason. And that's because sadly, we can't trust people to just act in good faith. I mean, you think of the environmental statutes, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, RCRA, CERCLA, I mean, all NEPA, all these pieces of legislation were passed, sadly, because there was, this idea that, of course, government we need to ensure that there be a process, and that we can't, just do and pursue certain actions or that will have a detrimental impact to the environment. So to answer your question, I think, yes, there is a positive side to this, which is, the communities, when you're going through a NEPA process, we are right now as UAMPS, I've had the pen on on a EIS process in the Colorado River.
And you might want to just say what that is.
Oh, sorry, an environmental impact statement. So it's essentially the process at the heart of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA, has anyone not heard of NEPA? I just want to, okay. Well, NEPA sets forth the ground rules, right? If the federal action is going to permit a mine or whatever, it's a federal action. So that can mean that they're approving private actors to take action on, say, federal lands or action that involves federal resources. So the NEPA process, you know, sets forward certain things, and this gets back to what Carter was saying, where there's stakeholder engagement. What I was saying is right now UAMPS is a cooperating agency on a NEPA process underway right now. I just came from Denver, where I was talking about this with other stakeholders, with the Bureau of Reclamation, because we generate power off the Glen Canyon Dam. And you know, so I think what we're seeing, and as we're living right now, myself drafting the comments, NEPA, there's value, there's tremendous value to ensuring that the general welfare of the public is acknowledged, is followed, is heeded. I mean, these are public lands, these are public resources that the public should have a chance to comment on as to how they're administered or dealt with. And so I do think that there's a tremendous value to that, where I think somehow, and I think this is maybe, you know, coming around to what we were maybe talking about earlier, or what I mentioned earlier about what we're talking about in Washington, is where has now NEPA become the roadblock to getting more environmentally friendly or sustainable energy resources online, right? NEPA should guide the process to the good outcome. So we're getting good informed decision making, but NEPA has at times too been, in my view, abused such that it's preventing some of the good that could come of it. So I do believe, though, to answer your question, the process, and there needs to be process in place to protect the public welfare. And so I feel like that's something that we should not also forget. It's just, how do we now improve it?
And how would you improve it?
Do you want my list?
We got a couple
long.
minutes, yeah.
No, I'll be brief. I think, you know, and this is where I feel like, you know, when we evaluate candidates, you know, we have a general election on our hands coming up. I don't know if you knew there's a presidential election. But there is a real value to actually getting smart people in Congress. Sadly, that's not always the case. And, you know, you do need to approach the job with a certain level of intellect and interest in solving the problem, because blanket red meat statements, while fun to throw out and they score you awesome political dividends, doesn't move the needle, right? We've been talking about permitting reform since I was a kid, right? And yet nothing's happened. Same with immigration reform, all of these things. And so to
Well,
go,
and I would add all those kind of asides, bombastic statement, not getting to the point of it, makes permitting harder, because you get to the local level and all those mindsets have filtered down and they're like, wait, what? This is green, this is about whatever it is. And you got to get past that to get back to what is the project? What are you trying to get accomplished?
yeah, and I think one, well, to give you one example of one thing I think we should try to incorporate more of into the decision making. So as part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, interstate transmission siting projects fell under a different.
Electricity transmission
Yeah,
projects.
electricity. Yes, thank you.
And with this interstate electricity transmission project, you have to deal with NEPA, but you also have to get approval from states to actually put in the transmission lines, isn't that right?
Correct. And therein lies the problem, right? We're a confederated country of 50 states, right? Where we have these, you know, federalism's great until you're wanting to cite an interstate transmission project.
Yeah.
And of course, we have the Interstate Commerce Clause and Dormant Commerce Clause to, you know, sort of deal with some of these issues as they arise. But needless to say, getting projects of national significance implemented should really be the guiding principle. And what I was going to say is, part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, interstate siting projects now kind of were treated a little differently, such that, you know, if essentially there was this transmission project that was of national security, national significance, and there's criteria that would go into that. I'm trying to just,
Big, spans many states.
yeah, allows for enhancement of reliability within the grid, all those things. They would get prioritized treatment effectively. I'm trying to just summarize it quickly. Those sorts of actions I think are really, really meaningful. Also, the other thing that I think is really important too is setting in parameters. Again, as an attorney, I'm all about process, but you know, there comes a point too where there's abuse of process, whereby we should be able to set parameters, time frame
You're
limitations,
talking about statute of limitations or time
statutes
to
of limitation.
complete an EIS?
It could be statutes of limitations, the time frame in which an agency has to finish an EIS, reevaluating the original purpose and need. At the heart of any environmental process included in NEPA is the agency has to state the purpose and the need for the act. And agencies have a fair amount of discretion. But what would be, I think, really helpful and meaningful too is understanding that within the NEPA framework, certain agencies can have what they call categorical exclusions. This is getting into a little bit of the weeds here, but categorical CATXs, as they're called, categorical exclusions allow for an expedited review process of specific activities. So Congress can say, okay, well, if you're going to trim the hedge, that's clearly like you're just like an aesthetic change, right? Let's just say that's a different thing than uprooting the hedge. I just came up with that analogy
That's a
on the
good
fly.
one. That's really
Um,
good.
And I'm saying, you know, like, obviously, I don't think there's going to be a huge, you know, detrimental impact to the agency trimming a leaf. But uprooting it, that's a little different. So Congress can go through and say, okay, for all of these activities that we can all agree on, agency stakeholders are largely not going to have an impact on the project. Let's create a categorical exclusion so that all that activity can already fast pass essentially.
And the oil and gas industry has some of those. Is that right?
I'm
Or you're not an expert.
I'm
in
sure,
oil
but
and
I'm
gas,
not,
right,
yeah,
you're
I'm not an
Okay, I don't wanna-
expert on that.
But that is kind of goes back to Congressman Curtis's permitting and transmission reform. That might be where there's some potential synergies. Possibly.
Okay, but I didn't want to interrupt. You were explaining how to improve permitting and transmission approval.
Yeah, I think, and you know, we're not a transmission utility. We rely on Pacific Corp as the they're the transmission utility for the state. If you look at all the wires on the map, you'll see all these different, like, we call balancing authorities, BAs. Essentially, they run the wires, right? Think of the wires. When I say wires, we're
Like
thinking
an air traffic
transmission.
controller.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. I think of it as like a highway too. That's the other thing. People are like, why don't you just run more projects over the existing highway? Well,
Yeah.
I mean, we're not UDOT. We can't just keep ever expanding the freeway. We you know, we're constrained to a certain amount of traffic, right? So when you have a number of electrons on that highway going back and forth, you know, we hear congested, right? Well, we have congested transmission. We have an
Then we have blackouts.
we have congested transmission such that a lot of clean energy projects can't avail themselves of that transmission because there's bottlenecks, hence the need for more transmission. So
He's 100% right. Exactly. The one other layer I was going to say is that it's interesting because in every place as you were talking, we've had some interesting permitting challenges that they had that were very, very local. These were not NEPA, these were local. What are we going to do about the tumbleweeds? And we're like, well, we'll build and they're like, no. What are you going to do about the tumbleweeds?
Tumbleweeds that are being caused by the project?
No, coming over the fences into the project area. And one of the guys is like, well, I'll just chop them up. The county commissioner I thought he was going to jump out and grab the guy's throat. He's like, no, you won't chop them up because that will cause more to happen. They're going to seed them. We were in one area, this was in a different state. They're like, what are you going to do about the prairie dogs? And we have a plan. I mean, there's a way that we work with a third party, all that sort of stuff. They're like, no, we want y'all to exterminate the prairie dogs? What are you going to do for an extermination plan? We're like, no, we're not. So it's very, very, very local. And I like your thinking, Mike, on finding things that we can agree to early and just get them out of the way.
So do you think there's, in terms of improving this process, making it go more quickly for clean energy, do you think there's a role for the federal government as well as, and what can we do to help support support this process in terms of influencing federal policymakers as well as talking with our local communities?
I think y'all having this today is a great, I mean, it's dynamite. The fact that you had a congressman that's running for Senate come, you've got state legislators here. That's a testament to the fact that you started the process and just stick with it, being consistent, making sure that they hear from you. And I think the way Congressman Curtis kind of spoke to how you approach them will help change their minds a little bit on where you can find some common ground instead of where they're wrong always or right. You know, just I think that it was a lot of good stuff that he talked about this morning.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, we look at just within the delegation, I do think representing municipalities, I do think that of course the local stakeholder engagement is without a doubt essential. And I think it's something that is really important at the bedrock of the value of NEPA. I think, again, amen to what Carter just said. And you look to it like, I mean, Senator Lee right now, he could become the next chair of ENR in the US Senate.
And ENR is?
Sorry, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He is working with Senator Heinrich of New Mexico on some pretty cool legislation to address NEPA reforms as it relates to geothermal. Geothermal is going to be a necessary component to reaching our carbon-free energy goals. As we see where nuclear is headed and where the future is very, very bright for nuclear, again, we have to also be undertaking these other measures. And so, again, I think it's this, what you said to Carter, quoting the congressman, it's your approach of how you go about this. I mean, yes, we are in a very polarized environment right now. And yes, certainly more so as that felt that's felt more so than other issues when it comes to the environment. And rightly so, this is a very personal issue for all of us. I think the approach is really, really important. And I pivoting back to where I was headed with talking about Senator Lee, very, very conservative member of Congress. And you have Senator Heinrich, and, they're both on the same committees of jurisdiction. They're working on some issues. And you have Congressman Curtis, you have Congressman Peters of California, Congresswoman DeGette. I had a chance to work with her staff. She's a Democrat from downtown Denver. It's the approach. And sadly, we don't see that sometimes in Washington. We see a lot of, vitriol and bickering. And I think we can start to be that positive agent for change when we're able to at least approach people in a human way and be like, hey, we all care about this land. No matter what people say, those people who live in Utah care about Utah, whether that's a rancher or a farmer or a climber or a rafter, we all care. And approaching it with that mindset is I think, the best first step to developing, like as Carter mentioned, that shared interests. But yeah, I think it certainly takes engagement. So again, whatever you guys are doing, keep doing it. I mean, I know what you're doing, so I shouldn't say whatever you're doing. Keep doing it.
So we have just a few minutes before I open up to questions. Do you have any comment on the interconnection queue and what role that might play?
It's crowded. I know that. I don't have a real, I mean, I wish it was faster. I wish all our projects were front line and all that sort of stuff, but
What is the current, like, if you want to put you want to develop a new solar array in southern Utah, and you say, hey, how long would we have to wait to, be approved to get onto the grid? What would that look like right now?
depends on where you are in the line, and you might have to pay extra to get in front. I mean, there's a whole number of issues. And you probably should have thought about it like 5, 6, 7 years
Can you
ago.
pay more and get
You
a higher spot?
you can work with other companies that are kind of in line, but I heard this was more of an anecdote from some folks that are in this business saying they want projects to be, there's a lot of dead solar projects that aren't going to get, and that they want those cleared out so they can kind of get a better shot.
Is it your understanding that there's movement in that area right now, that policymakers are going to be addressing this?
I haven't, not that I necessarily know of.
Yeah, I don't know. FERC, if any, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, created in the 70s, I think under the Carter administration, is the entity, when I was talking about interstate projects, whether that's gas pipelines or wires, transmission projects, they are the ones who act as the federal arbiter of that process. They have struggled to maintain quorum, which is its own issue. But needless to say, you know, our comment with regard to just the immediate issues we're seeing at UAMPS is the interconnection queue is clogged, right? There's a backlog. And the frustration, and I might be upsetting some people here, is that as a load serving entity, we have a legal obligation to provide power to retail end users. We sometimes can find ourselves 10, 50, 40, whatever places behind in the wait list, behind projects in the interconnection queue for whom there is not that responsibility. So there does need to be changes to this process, because at the end of the day, you know, no disrespect to anyone developing an energy project, but we have a legal obligation to keep the lights on, and there should be some weighted factor that allows us to move these projects along further and faster. And I think a lot of the process can work itself out. I mean, you have these incentives where I think they can sort of align better, but it's just the time frame in which we have to make that alignment, right? We are dealing with explosive growth in the West, and energy demand is not going to plateau anytime soon. So if we need more power, and that power is harder to connect into the interconnection queue, this is why we need to essentially elect smarter people to Congress too. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. And if you were to have wave a magic wand to improve the process, you know, in just a few sentences, what would you do?
I'd have a better transmission across the country and better interconnectivity across the country. It would be better for the state, be better for the region, be better for businesses here, economic development, straight up.
Yeah, I think there needs to be, again, we need to approach things with a level of urgency and prioritization that I think when you look at, say, China and Russia, because we're not just functioning in this vacuum. China and Russia get stuff done, obviously, because they don't really have to care about these things called NEPA and democracy. But at the same time, I do think we need to take note of, at a certain point, our energy is a national security issue. And if we can't be, frankly, tinkering with some of these things that can bring the world's greatest nation to its knees. There's a great book called The Brittle Grid or Brittle Wires. There's a book written around the Reagan years. Highly recommend it. And it's really sobering to read that book and recognize the same issues they were discussing in the 80s.
About the grid access.
We're still dealing with now.
Mhm.
And it's exponentially worse when we talk about aging infrastructure, the risks that provides. So yeah, I think at a certain point in this country, you know, needs to approach energy as though it is a national security issue of highest importance. So that would be that needs to be the mindset with which Congress addresses energy and our ability to develop these resources.
And development here in America, energy, the whole energy independence. I'm very proud of the fact that when we drive by Mona and say, that's providing power to 6 Utah cities. And it's really pretty cool. It's not solving all the world's problems, but it is providing power to 6 Utah cities. And that's really something to be proud of.
Thank you both for what you're doing.
Thank you.
We might have time for a question or two. Are there any questions out there? Oh, so many. How about Aaron?
My aunts worked on NEPA issues professionally for a few decades, and I keep telling her about all the great work we're doing in CCL. But it seems like she's a little bit nervous about any changes to NEPA. What would you say to her?
Change is inevitable. And I think but I think what Mike said earlier, that to make changes at NEPA is a process. So there'll be a process to make smart changes, and hopefully they can make them in a expedited fashion.
Yeah, I think you saw this. So, and probably if everyone's forgot about this, there's been a bajillion news cycles of more relevance. But right at the time there was the debt ceiling negotiation. As part of that deal, then Speaker McCarthy worked in some compromises on NEPA reform, very minor. And I told my board at the time, I said, mark my words, this will be the most significant thing that happens with permitting reform this Congress. And sadly, I think I'm going to be right. But I do think that change is there. My point being is, as marginal as that change was, it's on the minds of members of Congress, whether that's a Democrat or Republican. There's an interest and an energy, no pun intended, behind getting some of this done. And so while it may not be this Congress, I don't know, as we're heading into an election year, there are a number of other, issues and challenges for Congress to deal with. I do think that at a certain point, I mean, unless we're wanting to avoid blackouts, Congress will have to deal with this. And I see it happening, so.
I'm getting the, Okay, thank you both very much for taking your time to come here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.